I keep thinking about the moment it all began. Not our first meeting, though God knows I've replayed that one enough times in my mind, but the exact instant when I knew my life was about to change forever. It was a Tuesday evening in July, muggy as only an Oklahoma summer can be, when Mason's fingers brushed mine across the wooden table of that little cafe in Tulsa. 8 years I'd gone without feeling anything like that, a simple touch that somehow set everything inside me trembling. 8 years since Dan died, taking with him the person I thought I'd be for the rest of my life. Yet there I was at 50, sitting across from a man with kind eyes and a poet's soul, suddenly remembering what it felt like to want something more than the quiet, ordered life I'd built for myself. Let me back up. You deserve the whole story. I've never been spontaneous. My classroom at Jefferson High in Austin has the same posters on the walls that I put up 15 years ago. My lesson plans evolve, but the structure of my days has remained unchanged since I started teaching American history. I have a collection of rare mercury dimes that sit in felt-lined cases, cataloged by year and mint mark. I restore classic cars, slowly, methodically, on weekends. I do the New York Times crossword in pen. Order has been my sanctuary, especially after Dan's accident left my world in chaos. The teaching conference in Tulsa wasn't even on my radar until Eliza, our department head, came down with pneumonia 2 weeks before. "Claire," she'd croaked over the phone, "I need you to go instead. The school's already paid for everything." It wasn't a request so much as an assignment, and I'd never been good at saying no to Eliza. So there I was, in an unfamiliar city, with an afternoon to kill between conference sessions. The downtown public library caught my eye, a beautiful Art Deco building with green copper detailing that had developed that perfect patina. I've always found libraries comforting. The smell of books, the hushed atmosphere, the sense of time slowing down. What I didn't expect was the small crowd gathered in the reading room, watching two elderly men hunched over a chessboard, their faces masks of concentration. I stood at the back, watching the game unfold. One of the players, a white-haired man with enormous bushy eyebrows, moved his bishop across the board with a flourish. From somewhere to my right, I heard a low chuckle. "Showboating," a deep voice murmured. "He's 3 moves from checkmate, and not in his favor." I turned to find the source of the commentary. He was tall, with broad shoulders, and a security guard's uniform that looked freshly pressed despite the heat. His skin was the color of dark walnut, and his close-cropped hair and beard were peppered with silver. But it was his eyes that held me, so gentle they seemed almost at odds with his imposing frame. "You play?" I asked, keeping my voice low. "Every day," he said with a small smile. "Part of the job description." I raised an eyebrow. "Library security guards are required to play chess? Only the ones who want to connect with the regulars." He extended his hand. "Mason Quinn, Claire Jennings." His hand engulfed mine, warm, calloused, steady. We stood side by side, watching the game conclude exactly as Mason had predicted. As the small crowd dispersed, he asked, "Are you looking for anything in particular today, Ms. Jennings?" "Claire," I corrected automatically. "And no, I'm in town for a teaching conference, just killing time between sessions." "What do you teach?" "American history, high school." He nodded appreciatively. "Brave woman, teenagers and history, both challenging in their own ways." "Says the former police officer," I replied, then immediately wondered how I knew that. He hadn't mentioned it. A flicker of surprise crossed his face. "What gave me away?" I felt my cheeks warm. "The way you stand. My husband was a state trooper before he switched to private security. You develop a certain posture in law enforcement, scanning, always aware." I didn't mention Dan's death. I never did with strangers. Mason studied me with new interest. "Good observation. I was with Tulsa PD for 18 years. And now the library?" Something closed in his expression, just slightly. "Change of pace? What section would you recommend for someone with an afternoon to spare, history teacher?" I recognized the deflection, but didn't press. "What are you in the mood for? Revolution? Reconstruction? The Roaring Twenties? How about something on the Dust Bowl? Local history?" I smiled. "Lead the way." We wandered into the stacks, and he guided me to a section on Oklahoma history. As he pulled books from shelves, I noticed the careful way he handled them. Reverent almost. He didn't just work here, he loved this place. You write poetry, I said, another observation slipping out unbidden. This time, he laughed. A rich, deep sound that seemed to vibrate in the quiet space between bookcases. Now that's impressive. How did you figure that out? I gestured to his hands. The ink stains on your fingers, blue, not black. And there's a small notebook outline in your breast pocket. Plus, there's something about the way you speak, measured, like you're weighing each word. I don't know whether to be impressed or concerned about how transparent I am. Don't worry, I'm unusually observant. My students call me the Hawk. He selected a book and handed it to me. Steinbeck gets all the attention with Grapes of Wrath, but this local account gives a different perspective on the Dust Bowl migration. Less literary flourish, more hard truth. Our fingers brushed as I took the book, and something electric passed between us. A recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits. He seemed to feel it too. His eyes held mine a moment longer than necessary. The library closes at 6, he said. But there's a cafe across the street that stays open late. Good coffee, better pie. Was he asking me out? Was I ready for that? 8 years since Dan, and I'd gone on exactly 2 dates, both disasters. But this didn't feel like those awkward setups friends had orchestrated. This felt natural. I'd like that, I heard myself say. My last session ends at 5. His smile transformed his serious face. I'll be waiting by the main entrance. I spent the afternoon in a state of distracted anticipation. The session on incorporating primary sources into curriculum might as well have been in Swahili for all I absorbed. Instead, I found myself thinking about Mason's hands, his voice, the way he'd known exactly which book to recommend. At 5 o'clock, I gathered my conference materials with unusual haste and walked the 6 blocks back to the library, allowing myself only one quick stop to check my reflection in a storefront window. My gray blonde hair was holding up despite the humidity, though a few strands had escaped my sensible bob. I straightened my lightweight blazer and took a deep breath. This is just coffee, I reminded myself. Not a date. 2 adults with common interests. He was waiting as promised, now in civilian clothes, dark jeans and a deep green button-down that complemented his complexion. He'd added glasses with tortoiseshell frames that somehow made him look both more intellectual and more approachable. Right on time, he said with that same warm smile. How was your session? Enlightening, I lied, then added more honestly. Though I was a bit distracted, his eyes crinkled at the corners. By local history, I hope? Something like that. The cafe was just as he'd described. Worn wooden tables, local art on exposed brick walls, and a display case of pies that made my stomach growl audibly. We settled into a corner table away from the evening crowd. So, he said after we'd ordered coffee and 2 slices of peach pie, what brought you to teaching? Family tradition. My mother taught English at the same high school for 30 years. I swore I'd never follow in her footsteps, but it called to you anyway. I nodded. There's something about helping young people connect with history, showing them it's not just dates and dead people, but real lives and choices that shape the world they live in now. I caught myself. Sorry, once I get started on this, I can go on for hours. Don't apologize. Passion is rare enough that it should never be hidden. The way he said it, with absolute sincerity, made me wonder what passions he kept close to his heart. Your turn, I said. 18 years in law enforcement to library security is quite a shift. His fingers tapped a slow rhythm on the table. For a moment, I thought he might deflect again. But then he said, 3 years ago, I responded to a hostage situation at a convenience store. Things went bad. Very bad. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. Afterward, I couldn't. The noise, the hypervigilance, PTSD, the department psychologist called it. I took a leave of absence, but when it came time to go back, he shook his head. I needed quiet. The library had an opening. Best decision I ever made. And the poetry? I asked gently. Therapy at first. My counselor suggested it. But it became more than that. A way to make sense of things, to find beauty, even in the broken places. He looked slightly embarrassed. I've even had a few published in small journals. I'd like to read them sometime, I said, then worried it was too forward. But he just smiled. I'd like that too. Our coffee and pie arrived, momentarily pausing the conversation. The first bite of peach pie was a revelation, sweet, spiced, and somehow tasting exactly like summer should. Oh my God! I mumbled through the bite. He laughed. Told you! Mrs. Abernathy has been making these pies for 40 years. Local legend. We talked for hours. About books we loved and hated. About my coin collection and his vintage radio restoration hobby. About growing up. Me in Central Texas. Him in North Tulsa. About teaching and learning, and the different paths that had brought us to that cafe on that particular evening. What we didn't talk about, at least not directly, was loss. I didn't mention how Dan's death had left me hollow for years, how I'd built my life around that absence. He didn't detail whatever had happened during that hostage situation. But somehow, the knowledge of our respective wounds hovered between us, an unspoken understanding. When the cafe began closing around us, I was startled to check my watch and find it was nearly 11. We'd been talking for 5 hours, and it had felt like minutes. I should get back to my hotel, I said reluctantly. I'll walk you. The night air was thick with humidity, but a slight breeze made it bearable. We walked slowly, neither of us apparently in a hurry to end the evening. The downtown streets were quiet, just the occasional car passing and the distant sound of music from a bar several blocks away. How long are you in Tulsa? Mason asked as we waited for a traffic light. The conference ends Thursday afternoon. 2 more days. He seemed to be calculating something. Would you like to have dinner tomorrow night? There's a place by the river I think you'd enjoy. My heart quickened. This was definitely a date. I'd love to. At my hotel, we stood awkwardly in the fluorescent glare of the lobby. Thank you for the impromptu tour of Tulsa's literary offerings, I said, suddenly shy. Thank you for seeing more than just a security guard. He took my hand and squeezed it gently. Good night, Claire Jennings. I'll pick you up here tomorrow at 7. That night, I lay awake in my hotel room, staring at the ceiling and feeling like a teenager again. I kept replaying moments from our conversation, the way his eyes had held mine, how comfortable it had felt to sit across from him. I tried to remind myself to be sensible. I lived in Austin. He lived in Tulsa. Even if there was a connection, what could possibly come of it? But logic couldn't silence the voice inside that kept whispering, something is happening here, something important. The next day's conference sessions dragged interminably. I checked my phone constantly, half expecting a message saying he'd changed his mind, but none came. By the time I returned to the hotel to change for dinner, I was a bundle of nerves. I'd packed for a professional conference, not a date, but I'd brought one dress, a simple navy blue wrap style that Dan had always said brought out my eyes. I hadn't worn it since his funeral. It felt both wrong and right to put it on now, like crossing some invisible threshold. Mason arrived precisely at 7, wearing charcoal slacks and a light blue shirt that made his dark skin glow. He brought me a small gift, a book of Dust Bowl photographs from the library's gift shop. For your classroom, he said, or your personal collection, whichever. The restaurant overlooked the Arkansas River, the city lights reflecting on its surface like scattered stars. Over grilled trout and roasted vegetables, our conversation flowed as easily as it had the day before. But there was an undercurrent now, a tension that made every glance, every accidental touch of our hands, feel significant. Tell me about your husband, Mason said during a lull, surprising me. I hesitated, then realized I wanted to tell him. Dan was solid, dependable, the kind of man who never forgot an anniversary or missed a school event. We met in college. He was studying criminal justice. I was in education. Married right after graduation. You loved him very much, Mason observed. I did. We had a good marriage, 20 years. Not perfect, but good. I toyed with my water glass. He died instantly. Semi-truck crossed the median. They told me he didn't suffer. I shook my head. Cold comfort that. I was angry for so long. At the truck driver, at God, at Dan for leaving me. It took years before I could remember him without that anger clouding everything. Mason nodded, understanding in his eyes. Grief changes us. Permanently, I think. It does. But not always for the worse. I met his gaze directly. I'm stronger now, more aware of how precious time is. His hand found mine across the table. I know exactly what you mean. After dinner, we walked along the riverfront path, city lights twinkling around us. It was still warm, but the breeze off the water made it pleasant. We stopped at a bench overlooking a small bend in the river, watching the moonlight ripple across the surface. May I ask you something personal? I said, emboldened by the darkness. Of course. What happened during that hostage situation? You don't have to tell me, but he was quiet so long I thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he said, armed robbery gone wrong. 2 gunmen, 5 hostages. We had the building surrounded, negotiator on the phone. Things were tense but under control. Then one of the gunmen, just a kid, 19, strung out on something, started getting agitated. His voice became detached, professional. I was point man on the entry team. When we heard shots inside, we went in. He paused. 2 hostages were already down. I confronted the younger suspect. He raised his weapon. I fired. You saved lives, I said softly. 3 of them, yes. But the kid I shot, Malcolm was his name, he lived. Paralyzed from the waist down. I visit him sometimes. He's in a rehabilitation center now, working on his GED. Mason's voice grew quiet. The thing is, I don't regret pulling the trigger. It was the right call. But afterward, I couldn't reconcile the part of me that could make that decision with the part that writes poetry about autumn leaves and restores antique radios. It was like I'd split in 2. I reached for his hand. But you're whole now. Getting there. He turned to face me, his expression suddenly vulnerable. Meeting you. It's the first time in 3 years I've felt fully present in a moment. Not trapped in the past. Not anxious about the future. Just here. I understood exactly what he meant. I felt it too. This strange, unexpected clarity in his presence. I live in Austin, I said, the words coming out more abruptly than intended. A sad smile crossed his face. I know. 800 miles between here and there. Also true. We just met. 2 days ago, he confirmed. This is crazy. Completely irrational, he agreed. And then he kissed me, gently at first, a question more than a demand. I answered by leaning into him, my hands finding his shoulders as his arms encircled my waist. It had been so long since I'd been kissed like that. Like I was precious. Like there was all the time in the world to discover each other. When we finally broke apart, I was trembling. I'm sorry, he said immediately. Too soon. No, I interrupted. Not too soon, just unexpected. I touched his face, the soft bristle of his beard against my palm. Good unexpected. The walk back to my hotel was charged with new awareness. We held hands, occasionally stopping to kiss again. Under a street lamp, beside a flowering crepe myrtle, at a crosswalk while waiting for the light to change. Each kiss was a revelation, a rediscovery of something I'd thought lost forever. At the hotel, I made a decision that surprised even me. Would you like to come up? His expression grew serious. Are you sure? I was 50 years old, a widow, far from home. I'd known this man for exactly 2 days. But something about him, about us together, felt more right than anything had in years. I'm sure, I said. That night changed everything. The tenderness between us, the care we took with each other's bodies and hearts. It wasn't casual or convenient. It was a beginning. In the pre-dawn light, we lay facing each other, his fingers tracing patterns on my bare shoulder. I have to go back to Austin tomorrow, I said, stating the obvious. I know. He tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. This doesn't have to be just a Tulsa thing, Claire. 800 miles, I reminded him. I have weekends off. There are flights, phones, email. I smiled at his determination. You're willing to try long distance? With someone you just met? With you? Yes. His certainty was both terrifying and exhilarating. Unless you don't want to. I want to, I whispered, I'm just scared. Of what? Of everything. Of caring about someone again. Of the distance. Of being 50 and feeling like a teenager with her first crush. He laughed softly. All valid concerns. But I'm pretty good at problem solving. And you strike me as remarkably adaptable for someone who does the New York Times crossword in pen. I smacked his shoulder playfully, then grew serious. I've built a life in Austin. My job, my friends, my home. I'm not asking you to give that up. Not now. Maybe not ever. I'm just asking for a chance to see where this goes. He cupped my face in his hand. One step at a time, Claire. And so it began. Our long-distance relationship. We developed a rhythm, phone calls every evening, texts throughout the day, video chats on weekends when we couldn't be together in person. Every 2 weeks, one of us would make the journey, he to Austin or me to Tulsa. Those weekends became islands of intensity in the ocean of our separate lives. In Austin, I showed him my world, the classroom where I'd taught for 15 years, the garage where I was slowly restoring a 1967 Mustang, the local diner where I ate breakfast every Saturday morning. He met my friends, charmed my neighbors, and fit into my life with surprising ease. In Tulsa, he introduced me to his universe, the small apartment filled with books and half-restored vintage radios, the chess club at the library, where he was something of a celebrity, the lake outside the city where he fished on his days off. I met his sister and her family, his fellow officers from his police days, the poets who gathered monthly to share their work at a local bookstore. The distance was hard, harder than I'd anticipated. There were nights when I ached for his presence beside me, when a phone call wasn't enough. There were misunderstandings that might have been resolved in minutes face to face, but instead festered for days across the miles. There were moments of doubt. Was this sustainable? Were we fooling ourselves? But there were also unexpected gifts in the separation. We learned to communicate with a clarity that might have taken years to develop otherwise. We cherished our time together, never taking a moment for granted. We built anticipation into the fabric of our relationship, the counting down of days until we'd be together again. 4 months in, during a weekend in Austin, we had our first serious fight. It started simply enough. He mentioned that a library position was opening up in Dallas. It's only a 4-hour drive from Austin, he said casually, over dinner at my house. Much more manageable than 8. I froze. You're thinking of moving to Dallas. I'm considering it. It would make seeing each other easier. But you love your job in Tulsa. Your sister is there, your poetry group, your whole support system. He looked confused. I thought you'd be happy about this. Happy that you'd uproot your entire life? When you're finally feeling stable again after everything you've been through? The thought of him sacrificing his hard-won peace for me was unbearable. It wouldn't be a sacrifice, Claire. It would be a choice. My choice. Based on what? A 4-month relationship with a woman you see every other weekend? My voice rose with emotion I couldn't contain. That's not enough reason to make such a huge change. His expression hardened. I think I get to decide what's enough reason for my own life decisions. Of course you do. But I don't want to be responsible for— You're not responsible for anything, he interrupted, anger edging his normally gentle tone. This is me, making a choice about my future. A future I was hoping might include more of you in it. By moving to a city where you know no one, taking a job that might not be as good as the one you have, all for a relationship that might not— I stopped myself, but too late. That might not what, Claire? Last? Work out? Is that what you're afraid of? I couldn't answer. The truth was, I was terrified. Not that he would move to Dallas and regret it, but that he would move closer, and we would discover that what we had couldn't survive proximity. That the magic existed precisely because of the distance, the anticipation, the idealized version of each other we maintained in our minds. You don't believe in us, he said quietly, the anger draining from his voice, replaced by something worse, disappointment. I want to, I whispered, but I've lost too much to trust this easily. He stood up from the table. I need some air. For an hour, I sat alone in my kitchen, tears streaming down my face, certain I'd ruined everything. When he finally returned, His expression was composed, but tired. I'm not going to push you," he said, sitting across from me. "And I'm not going to make any decisions about moving right now. But Claire, at some point, one of us will need to take a leap of faith if this is going to work long term. I hope it can be you, but if not, it might have to be me." We made up that night, but the question lingered between us. What would our future look like? Could we build something lasting across this distance? Or would one of us eventually have to uproot our life? And was what we had worth that kind of sacrifice? Summer turned to fall, fall to winter. We spent Thanksgiving in Tulsa with his sister's family, Christmas in Austin with my brother and his kids. With each visit, each holiday, each shared experience, the connection between us deepened. I found myself thinking of him at odd moments, wondering what he'd think of a book I was reading, imagining his laugh at something a student said, reaching for him in the night, only to find his side of the bed empty. In January, 6 months into our relationship, I received a job offer from a prestigious private school in Dallas, a position teaching advanced history with a significant salary increase and half the class load of my current job. I hadn't applied for it. Apparently, a colleague had recommended me. I didn't tell Mason right away. The timing seemed too convenient, too much like the universe conspiring to solve our distance problem. I needed to think it through without his influence, to be sure any decision I made was my own. For a week, I weighed the pros and cons. I loved my job at Jefferson High, but the new position would allow me more time for research and writing, something I'd always wanted to pursue. I'd miss Austin, but Dallas had its own charms. And of course, being a 4-hour drive from Tulsa instead of 8 would transform our relationship. Still, I hesitated. Moving would mean admitting how central Mason had become to my life. It would mean taking that leap of faith he'd talked about. It would mean risking everything. On a cold February evening, during one of our nightly calls, I finally told him about the offer. "That's incredible," he said, genuine excitement in his voice. "It sounds perfect for you." "It's a good opportunity," I agreed cautiously. "Have you decided?" I took a deep breath. "I'm leaning toward accepting." There was a pause. "Because of the job, or because of me?" "Both," I admitted. "The job is a dream position, and being closer to you, that would be wonderful. But I need to know it's the right move for me, regardless of us." "Does that make sense?" "Complete sense," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. I wouldn't want it any other way. The next weekend, Mason came to Austin. We spent Saturday morning at a classic car show, then headed back to my house to work on the Mustang. As we stood in my garage, hands greasy from changing the oil filter, Mason suddenly turned serious. "I need to tell you something," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. My heart stuttered. In my experience, that phrase rarely preceded good news. "I've been offered a position at Southern Methodist University. Library security supervisor. Better pay, better benefits, more responsibility." "In Dallas?" I whispered. He nodded. "I wasn't going to say anything until you'd made your decision about the teaching job. I didn't want to influence you." "When did you apply?" "December, after our fight about me potentially moving." He looked a bit sheepish. "I figured if you decided to stay in Austin, at least we'd be closer. And if you decided to take the Dallas job, well, we'd be in the same city." I laughed, the sound echoing in the garage. "So all this time, while I've been agonizing over this decision, weighing whether I was moving for the right reasons, I was doing the same thing," he finished, smiling. "We're quite a pair, aren't we?" Cautious to a fault. He pulled me into his arms, not caring about the grease on our hands. "So what do you think? Are we both moving to Dallas?" I looked up at him. This man who had unexpectedly become the center of my world. "It appears we are." "No regrets?" "Not a single one." 2 months later, I stood in my empty Austin house, preparing to lock the door for the last time. 8 years I'd lived there, the longest I'd stayed in any one place since college. It had been my refuge after Dan died, the quiet space where I'd rebuilt my life piece by piece. Leaving it felt momentous. Mason waited in the driveway, our 2 cars packed with the essentials we'd need until the moving truck arrived at our new place in Dallas the next day. We'd found a charming rental, a small house with a detached garage big enough for my Mustang restoration project and his growing radio collection. It wasn't as nice as my Austin home or as convenient as his Tulsa apartment, but it was ours. And that made all the difference. As I locked the door, a wave of emotion washed over me. Not regret, exactly, but acknowledgement of all that had happened within those walls, and all that I was leaving behind. Mason approached and put his arm around my shoulders. "You okay?" I nodded, leaning into his solid warmth. "Just saying goodbye. To the house? Or to who you were here?" I smiled at how well he understood me now. "Both, I think. This is where Widow Claire lived, the woman who built walls around her heart and filled the spaces with car parts and crossword puzzles. And who's moving to Dallas?" he asked gently. I turned to face him fully. "Someone braver. Someone who's learning to trust again. Someone who discovered it's never too late for a second chance." He brushed a strand of hair from my face. "I like her already." We stood there in the driveway of my old life, on the precipice of our new one together. I thought about the unlikely path that had brought us here. A last-minute conference assignment, a chance encounter in a library, a chess game between strangers. How easily it all might never have happened. "What are you thinking?" Mason asked, as we finally turned to walk to our cars. "That I'm 50 years old and starting over again. That I'm terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. That I have no idea what happens next." He smiled, the smile that still made my heart skip after all these months. "I believe that's called living, Claire Jennings." I reached up and touched his face, the beard that was more salt than pepper now, the eyes that saw me so clearly. "Then let's go live." As we drove away from Austin, two-car caravan style, him leading, me following, I felt not like I was leaving something behind, but like I was driving towards something essential, something I'd found when I wasn't looking, in a city I'd never planned to visit, with a man I'd never expected to meet. It wasn't the ending of my story, far from it. In many ways, at 50, I was just beginning to understand what it meant to truly live, to take risks, to love without reservation. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, that uncertainty felt like promise rather than threat. And as the Austin skyline receded in my rearview mirror, I smiled at the thought of all that waited ahead. A new city, a new job, a new home. And most importantly, a new understanding that life's most precious gifts often arrive when we least expect them, requiring only that we be brave enough to reach out and accept them.